Hi, I'm Barbara Lucas, and welcome to the Green Room, where we explore the environmental topics that green up our world. We're here today with Doug Tallamy, Professor and Chair of the Entomology and Wildlife Ecology Department at the University of Delaware, where he's been studying insects and their role in the environment for over 30 years. It's our great honor to have him with us to discuss his book, Bringing Nature Home: How You Can Sustain Wildlife with Native Plants. Doug, it's a great honor to have you here. Thank you so much for coming.
Very happy to be here.
We're interested in talking about this book. I'm particularly interested because it has been a big influence on me. I read it in 2007 when it first came out, and I think I've incorporated it into everything I've done since then when related to the environment. At first I thought it was going to be kind of a how-to book because you say how you can sustain wildlife with native plants as your subtitle, but actually I thought it was far more than that, kind of groundbreaking actually, and I think I'm not alone in that because I've noticed you being quoted all over the place, and it really has been a big influence. In fact, this movie that I did on pollinator decline, we're going to show a few minutes of it, and I just want to start out with that. Most of the insects in our world are beneficial to us.
Unfortunately, we have become a society that is very phobic about insects, very afraid of insects, very concerned about insect infestations, insect bites.
The balance of nature is delicate, and our attempts to wipe out insects affect the web of life.
Many times there are issues of safety.
But when no one in the household is allergic to stings,
It really is more harm to aggressively eradicate insects that use your home space because it creates a void in the balance. The birds will help to keep this balanced.
Some insects help you. They kill bugs for you.
Many insects are predators on other insects.
there's a perception that an insect-free yard is best for kids. But many a budding scientist got their start examining insects.
Grasshopper.
Children love insects and are fascinated by insects. And we, as adults, have a tendency to put the brakes on that, to really discourage children from experiencing and enjoying and observing insects in front yards, you know. It's a wonderful place to explore and to experience different biological phenomena going on.
When given a chance to experience insects, many children overcome their fears.
I would say that it is not boring to see bees. It's really fun.
We asked Sophie and Grace of Iowa City, Iowa, which they preferred, their manicured lawns back home or the prairie yard of the home they're visiting for the summer.
Like so much more room to romp around, things to explore. But in the short grass, you can't really like bend over and find stuff like crickets and stuff like bouncing all over the places.
So beautiful because all the butterflies and bees come out to get nectar from the flowers. And people spend like an hour mowing their lawn.
Yeah.
And the gas is expensive and it pollutes the air. And the pesticides, they go into the ground and then they go into the rivers, and then that's not good for the fish.
We don't need to devote our entire yard to natives like Grace's prairie. Every little bit that we do helps.
They can fly fairly far distances, so it's not like we have to turn everything into a wild habitat. If we keep creating more and more islands that eventually come together as this nice big whole landscape that's full of dots of wild habitat, then that's going to benefit wildlife in general, not just bees but also birds and other beneficial organisms.
If you're concerned about what the neighbors will think, put up some cues of care.
I know of some people who've actually put little yard signs in their yard saying, you know, this is habitat for bees, this is a pollinator conservation habitat, or something along those lines that can let the neighbors know that you're doing this on purpose.
The stability of the pollinator pyramid is of vital importance to the human race. But making the earth a better place for pollinators may require us to change how we think about our world. This movie is called The Pollinator Pyramid, but it could just as well have been called The Insect Pyramid, in that whether it be pollinators or insects in general, If we lose them, our ecosystems will collapse. And it is in our yards that we can prevent this from happening. Dr. Tallamy, may I call you Dr. Tallamy? I feel a little more comfortable. I know you asked me to call you Doug, but...
Call me whatever.
Okay. In your book, you talk a lot about trophic levels. Now, we all know that pollinators are extremely important, but your book makes a strong case for the fact that it's not just our our butterflies and our bees that are important. It's all the insects, because of this concept of bringing energy up through the trophic levels. And if you could sort of elaborate on that.
Be happy to. The first trophic level, of course, are plants. They're the organisms that capture energy from the sun and turn it into food for everything else. They put that energy in the carbon bonds of simple sugars and carbohydrates in the process that we call photosynthesis. And in that process, they produce oxygen, which is good for us, but they also produce all that food. If the food stays in the plants, it does not benefit anything else. So other organisms have to eat plants either directly or they have to eat something that ate plants. And the creatures that are best at eating plants are insects, which means so many other types of creatures rely on insects for the food that was generated by the plants. And that's what I mean by having energy move from the plant through insects to birds, to foxes, to black bears, to all kinds of other things that are not going to eat the plants directly.
All the things we really love seeing. We may not love seeing the insects, but we really need them in order to see all the rest.
Right. I like to think of insects as bird food.
Oh.
And then it doesn't sound so bad.
Yeah, true. And you talk a lot about needing a diversity of species, not just the, I think you call it the charismatic megafauna, in terms of the things that we really, or keystone species, things that scientists have focused on a lot. But you talk about all the species being important for a productive ecosystem. If you could address what you mean by productive.
Okay. A productive ecosystem is one that holds more energy within itself. In other words, it is supporting more life than an unproductive ecosystem. Simple ecosystems are not as productive, and they're simple because they're comprised of fewer species. The problem with an ecosystem that is not very diverse is that it's not very stable, which means if you remove one of those players, one of those species from the ecosystem, very often it can collapse the food web and the entire ecosystem will spin out of control. So a diverse ecosystem is far better than an undiverse one because it is more productive, but it's also more stable. And of course, we need these ecosystems to produce what we call ecosystem services. Just from a selfish perspective of humans, we need ecosystem services to keep our huge populations happy and healthy. And we can't afford to have unstable ecosystems that are going to collapse. And it's that diversity that keeps them stable.
I loved your metaphor of the Jenga block game. Could you tell us what that's all about?
Right. It's not actually my metaphor, and of course I forget who actually came up with it. But we talked about keystone species for years, citing things like beavers. Beavers, of course, make the dam that flood the field that then create an entire aquatic ecosystem. And if you take the beaver out, that whole aquatic ecosystem collapses. And we can cite a number of examples where that's the case. But it turns out every time we look at a species and try to figure out whether it's a keystone species or not, whether it has a vital role in its ecosystem, we find out that it typically does. So then what is a true keystone species? The Jenga model suggests that as Jenga is those blocks that you pile up and then you try to remove one without the whole thing collapsing. So if you see the entire tower as an ecosystem, which ones can you pull out without it collapsing? Well, that depends on which ones are already gone or which ones are present. So whether or not a species is a keystone species is a relative phenomena. Depends on what other species are there, what has already disappeared or what has been added. So every species could be a keystone species at a particular time in a particular circumstance.
And you mentioned in your book that provides kind of a relief to the scientists in that they don't have to constantly be trying to pick and choose and weigh relative importance. It's just all species are important.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tougher job. We have to say all of the species instead of just one or two keystone species. But it's also simpler conceptually.
Yeah.
We just save the whole works.
Yeah. Your book mentions, well, frequently, that we've got a decline in insects worldwide. So I looked up on the internet what might be the problem in Michigan. We have listed about 21 insect species either threatened or endangered. But there's something like, what, 4 million insect species in the world. So does that mean that we really don't have a very big problem around here?
No, it means that there are very few people looking for the problem. In general, people don't care about insects very much. There are only a few trained specialists that are looking at them. There are 4 million species, but we've only named 1 million of them. So most of these don't even have names yet. So for us to say, well, we know the population size of these insects 30 years ago, and now we'll compare the population size today and say, oh, there's fewer. That just hasn't been done in almost all the circumstances. So the only time you find an insect on an endangered species list is when it is itself charismatic. So it's usually a butterfly or the American burying beetle, which is it's the largest burying beetle in the world, and you know, a few flashy things like that. But most of them are going unnoticed.
And in terms of reasons for the decline in insects, you mentioned pesticide use, habitat loss you talk about a lot. You mentioned that the land mass in North America, lower 48, is something like 97% of it has been converted. But a lot of that is still green. When you drive around, you see a lot of woodlots, you see golf courses. What's the problem in terms of that kind of greenery?
3,400 species of plants in this country are what we call invasive species. They evolved someplace else, have been brought over by humans for one reason or another, and have escaped and are now displacing the native species that used to be here. So that's a lot of species of plants. And typically, if you measure the plant biomass of native plants versus non-native plants, about a third of the plant biomass out there is non-native. The problem with that is that these plants that evolved outside of our local food webs do not contribute very much to our local food webs, meaning that those insects that are vital in transferring the energy up the food web can't eat them. And if they can't eat them, that's the trophic level. Then those insects disappear, and then there's no food for those birds that are looking for the insects. So it starts with the plants. We are replacing the first trophic level, our native plant communities, with non-native plant communities, and that locks that energy up in those plants, and it doesn't go any further.
You had mentioned insects being so full of energy, comparing it pound for pound with hamburger, as much or more.
Actually, it's protein.
Protein.
Protein, yeah. Some studies have shown that insect protein is extremely high quality.
And that's important for bird reproduction. I guess there's the egg production and all that.
Right? It's not just birds. Everything that eats insects benefits from that high protein. And also organs in the abdomen of the insect called fat bodies. They are full of energy, very high energy. But birds, of course, are little dinosaurs. And one of the things we've learned about the dinosaurs is that they grew extremely quickly. And of course, so do birds. They are closely related. And you think about it, you go from an egg to a bird that's actually a little bit bigger than the adult in, 2 weeks, something like that in the nest. Very rapid growth rate. So they need high quality protein coming in. And that's why parent birds do not rear their young on seeds or berries in almost all circumstances. It's protein from one source or another, and in this country, in the temperate zone, it's almost always insects. As you move down into the tropics, they often use lizards and snakes and some other things they can get a hold of. But
yeah, that reminds me, you mentioned that alien shrubs and trees, often you see a lot of birds taking the berries or making nests in them, but your point was that if they're not producing the insects, the larvae, on these bushes, that's the time of the life cycle of the birds that's so crucial.
Right. Our birds do use these alien plants often in the fall, typically, when they're making berries. And that's one of the reasons these plants are invasive, because birds will eat the berry and then fly 10 miles and poop it out, poop out the seed. So they move very quickly. But when the birds are making more birds, when they're reproducing in the spring and early summer, that's when they need those insects. So if they're in a habitat that has been overrun with non-native plants, the insect load, the biomass of insects, we've done studies recently, we just got evidence this summer that both the abundance and the species diversity of insects on non-native plants is reduced by up to 3/4 when
Wow.
you're talking about non-native plants. And that's, if I cut your diet by 3/4, you would notice it. So do the birds.
And isn't there a decline in birds?
Tremendous decline, yeah.
Really?
There was a big study commissioned by President Bush, actually, and the results came out last year. And the conclusion is really that 1/3 of our bird species are in serious trouble. They use the word endangered, but they're in steep decline and in serious trouble.
I think I noticed in your book that you mentioned that bees prefer native plants as well.
Okay, we have to be specific when we use the word bee. We have 5,000 species of native bees in this country. And then, of course, there's one species of honeybee, which is not native. That was introduced, and it's an excellent pollinator of an awful lot of plants. But people tend to think of bees as being honeybees and not even realize that we have so many species of native bees. Many of the species of native bees are specific on a particular flower morphology, particular flower type, and sometimes on a particular flower species. So that tight link means if the flower disappears, the bee disappears. Or if the bee disappears, the flower disappears.
One thing I found interesting was your description of your epiphany when you had bought some property that had a lot of alien plants. And when you say alien, I think you mean anything that's not native to the area. And tell us about that epiphany.
Well, I am an entomologist, and as most entomologists, I walk around outside looking for insects, particularly in the spring. We've gone all winter without seeing them. And they're my friends. I like to welcome them back, and I typically look under leaves and see what's there. Well, it's easier to find them if you look for the damage that they're making, little holes in the leaves, and say there could be something here. So this one afternoon I was walking around in my alien jungle of our backyard, and I noticed that things like Japanese honeysuckle and Japanese knotweed and oriental bittersweet and autumn olive and Norway maple and multiflora rose, those are the plants that were predominating in my backyard. Had no insect damage at all compared to some of the native oaks and black cherry and walnut, which had typical loads of damage. That was the epiphany. I said, well, of course our insects can't eat these non-native plants. And this is actually predicted by plant-insect interaction theory that I learned way back in graduate school. When we weren't talking about alien plants versus native plants, we were talking about plants that insects co-evolved with versus ones they did not. And of course, if a plant evolved in China, our insects did not co-evolve with, and they don't have the adaptations for detoxifying the chemical defenses that are in those plants. So that was the epiphany, just recognizing that there were insects present on our native plants and not on these others. And
that perhaps, I'm tying it in my head to your comment that we normally have been taught to believe that pest-free is something that we should seek out, right. And maybe it's the opposite?
Well, of course, all the plants I just mentioned that were invading our backyard, had invaded our backyard, are escapees from the ornamental industry. We brought them over as ornaments for our suburban plantings. And if you think about the plants that are in your yard or that are in your neighbor's yard, most of them, actually we just measured that this summer as well, 85% of the plants in a typical suburban yard are non-native.
Wow.
So again, they're not contributing to the local food web. And yet, 85% again, 85% of our woody invasive plants in this country are escapees from the horticulture industry. So we are purposely introducing plants that are labeled pest-free in the nursery. We know that insects can't eat these plants. And of course, as a gardener, people said, well, that's great. I want my garden to be insect-free. And if your garden was the only garden in the area, it wouldn't make a big difference. But now suburbia is everywhere. We've removed nature from almost all parts, particularly in the east here, and the biodiversity that depends on those native plant communities has got to survive in our suburban neighborhoods, and we're not giving them the plants to do that. So That's what I'm trying to promote, is to increase the percentage of the native plants that used to be in your particular area to support the food webs and all the creatures, all those birds that you feed all winter long, with the insects that develop on those plants. And you know, the thing that people worry about the most is that if you have all these insects in your yard, they're going to eat your plants and they'll be full of holes and ugly. But if you actually recreate a balanced ecosystem in your yard, so you've got the birds and you've got the predatory insects and the parasites and the insect diseases, you're actually going to see very few insects because there'll be all these other things eating them. But you'll see those other things.
A balance.
You'll have that. You'll have a very healthy natural enemy community, keeping those insects in check.
Yeah, you talked about avoiding having to micromanage your yard, which I thought, yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. We're putting out pesticides, we're watering, we're fertilizing, we're spending all kinds of time and complaining about it, complaining about the cost, complaining about the repercussions of the pesticides, and it's tell us about this monoculture of the lawn thing. I thought that was interesting.
Another thing we measured this summer, 92% of the 65 homes that we measured, 96% or 92% of the landscapable area was in lawn. So most of our suburban neighborhoods are lawn, which is a barren monoculture of typically a single species of grass, European cool season grass, maybe more than one species. And then just a few woody plants or herbaceous plants that are added to that. So that is a barren landscape compared to what used to be there. I mean, in the east, it used to be a eastern deciduous forest that was thriving. So think about what you've taken out and replaced it with, and then wonder why you don't have much life left in your yard.
And you mentioned the vulnerability that can be created to something like the Japanese beetle grubs, and that.
Right. Our big pest problems are from insects that we have brought in, oftentimes with these ornamental plants that we've brought in from someplace else. And Japanese beetle is a perfect example. We have billions of Japanese beetles flying around the country because as larvae, they are grass specialists. And we have given them 45.6 million acres of grass to eat. And we're adding 600 square miles of grass every year for these Japanese beetles. No wonder we have a lot.
And didn't you say that spiders can help control the Japanese beetle grubs, or?
No.
No? Okay.
Spiders are real important predators of lots of our insects. But Japanese beetle grubs,
I read
of course,
that somewhere.
Boy, I don't know about that. They're underground.
Okay.
There's a Taphiid wasp they brought in to try to control it. But that's the problem. You bring in an insect from someplace else and its whole complex of natural enemies is left behind. And then we try to supplement with a few here and there, but it's very difficult to regain that control, that balance.
I need to ask you, how long does it take a plant that's brought in to become native?
Okay, that's a great question. And I'm going to use the example of Phragmites australis, the, what do they call it, common reed. It was brought over here as packing material in early ships and has been in parts of the eastern U.S. for 400 years, 400 plus years. Its genotype is native to Europe. We have to decide what it means to become native, and I think that we can look at the potential of that plant to support food. The best way to measure that is to go back to Europe and say, how many insects does Phragmites support there? It's 176 species of insects. Here, it's been here for 400 years, and so far only 5 have adapted to it. So to reach its full potential, to become a native, it will have to have 176. How long will it take? Don't know. 10,000 years, 100,000 years. It will take a long time because it's very slow to get these insects to adapt to these plants.
And by that time, we'll have
right.
lost.
By that time, we lose all the plants that the native insects are adapted to. So.
And what about butterfly bush? A lot of people love that for the butterflies.
Butterfly bush is itself invasive. It does not stay in your garden. It moves. I know it's a beautiful flower, and it produces lots of nectar for the butterflies as well as other pollinators. So it does do those things. The problem is that it doesn't make any butterflies. So if you make your butterfly garden out of a whole series of plants that are great nectar producers, but they're not larval host plants for any butterflies, you're relying on some other ecosystem to create butterflies. When everybody's doing that, nobody's making any butterflies. So it's best to have host plants of the butterflies in your area, in your butterfly gardens. And of course, Buddleia, the butterfly bush, is not a host plant to anything in this part of the world. And of course, the other problem is it's invasive, just like these other ornamental plants. So one of the major, I just got back from Hawaii visiting my daughter, and butterfly bush is a major invasive species over there.
Really?
Yeah, it's all over the place. So.
Well, I love the positive message in your book. You talk about biodiversity being a renewable resource, and I love that. I'm going to read the last line of your book. It says, "As gardeners and stewards of our land, we have never been so empowered, and the ecological stakes have never been so high." I think that sums up really well that we have a great responsibility to do the right thing in our yards. I really appreciate you getting this message out to so many people.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to view the Pollinator Pyramid movie we showed earlier in its entirety, go to www.ewashita.org/greenroom. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.